Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom and think. My name is Sam Dover. I'm a beauty and personal care category director at Mintel. And today we're going to be discussing the rising cost of living, so what it means for consumers and how brands can respond. Now, this is a topic that we've discussed throughout this season of the podcast, but we've decided to revisit it as it's something that our clients are constantly asking us about. So with that in mind, the plan today is to answer some of our most frequently asked questions, including some of the questions that we received from our recent British Lifestyles webinar. So with that in mind, I'm joined by Toby Clark, Richard Shepherd and Francesca Smith. So to get us all started, can I just ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves? Let's start with Richard.
Hi Sam, my name is Richard Shepherd. I'm the Category Director of Business to Business, Social and Economic Research here at Mintel, and a lot of that involves talking about a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, so we should have a good conversation.
I'm Francesca. I'm a lifestyles analyst here in the UK, and I research and write reports about different consumer groups and their behaviours, so like Generation Z, parents, seniors, people like that, and also cover cross-category topics like sustainability and charitable giving.
I'm Toby Clark. I'm Director of Research for EMEA at Mintel. I look after all of the, mainly the UK reports, but I tend to get dragged out when things go horribly wrong for the economy. So I covered the financial crisis, I covered COVID, and now I'm spending a lot of time looking at the cost of living crisis.
Thank you. So to get us started, I just want to set the scene a little bit. So consumers around the world are facing exceptionally high inflation, and as a result of that, they are feeling pretty worried at the minute, or so I would imagine. So with that in mind, what are people most worried about, and how much optimism have they managed to retain amidst all of the uncertainty so far?
I'll try and keep some optimism at the end, but the first thing to understand is that consumers really are worried about their finances at the minute. So some of the research that we did for our recent British Lifestyles report found that 85% of Brits, cutting through all different demographic groups, so that they are worried about the rising cost of living. And that tallies with regular research that we do here, where every month we track household financial well-being, how consumers feel that their finances have changed over the last year or so, and also confidence for the coming year. In all three of those measures, we've seen substantial falls over the last year, and that's ramped up as well in the last few months. And so to put it into a bit of context, when we look at confidence for the year ahead, in August of this year, we had the weakest set of results for that particular question in all the time that we've been tracking confidence, which started back in 2009. So this is kind of a historic level of a confidence crisis, so to speak. But despite that, most people do continue to get by. So we do have, a similar trend when it comes to financial well-being, where people are feeling worse off than they did previously. But in September, 71% of people still told us that their household finances were at least okay, so they were at least making ends meet, and 73% said that they should be fine over the next year, even though within that, 50% did say that they had concerns about their finances going forward. So there is some reason for optimism, but it is a very tight situation for a lot of people. Where we see the biggest sort of cause for optimism, if that is the tone, is in the demographic differences that we see. So, we'll often see the current situation described as a cost of living crisis. And for a lot of people, that is precisely what it is a crisis. And there's people having to make a lot of really difficult decisions and really struggling to get by. But it still remains the case that there are, there is a group of higher earners and people who were particularly well set going into this period who are able to absorb those price rises and are still showing a good degree of resilience and ability to ride out the storm. And that offers opportunity to brands going forward.
Amazing. So I'm going to move the question on now, because I don't want to get too bogged down in the scene setting, so to speak. So I'm sure what a lot of our listeners want to know about is how this is impacting consumers. So in that kind of environment, what kind of behavioural shifts are we seeing, or what do we think we're going to see in future? How will consumers change to kind of weather the storm, so to speak?
I mean, we're already seeing some shifts in behaviour, and a lot of them are the kind of things that you'd expect when times are tough. So we're seeing people saying they're shifting to lower cost retailers, and you can see some of the discounters like breaking through and like really challenging the mainstream grocers. We're seeing people talking about buying private label more often, so trading down within categories. So there's all sorts of areas of what you call sort of classic recessionary spending, where people cut back on discretionary items, and they are starting to come through already. Although, as you know, I'm not a beauty expert, but I know from quizzing you on it, you've got some of the upsides coming through as well. So like, people talk about lipstick effect a lot, about people spending money on these sort of everyday indulgences. And like I said, that's already coming through. So I know from what you said, Sam, that lip colour has been doing pretty well in the last 6 months or so. So there's always upsides. Like there's always sort of positive shifts in behaviour, and so you've got to balance them against the threats as well.
Yeah, definitely. Any beady-eyed listeners out there may have seen Johnny, one of our food and drink analysts this week, talking about the indulgence index. So that's been in the media this week as the kind of replacement term for the lipstick effect, because the lipstick effect is essentially something that impacts across categories. This idea that consumers treat themselves to affordable luxuries that make them feel good. So that was definitely something interesting in terms of, although I very much come at it from biased, the lipstick effect is almost direct in my category. It definitely has broader reaching implications. So one thing I know that we've definitely had questions about from clients is the kind of macro versus micro behaviors. So how they're changing kind of big things like holidays and big ticket spend versus kind of small ticket items. So things like their kind of everyday groceries. What kind of shifts are we seeing?
I think in terms of big ticket items, we know that from our research for British Lifestyles that around half of consumers were delaying some kind of major purchase of either a holiday or an event or actually like just an item. But I think that's not really quite the full picture. I think going back to what Toby was saying about luxuries, one area that's going to do well there is luxury travel and holidays, and that kind of feeds into that wider idea of the rise of appreciation and desire for experiences. So obviously over the pandemic, we were kind of cooped up for so long. People weren't able to do things. And now we're seeing that kind of bounce back where people are wanting to spend more on leisure and out of home experiences and holidays. So I think those categories where they're providing that really unique experience, whether that be within leisure or overseas travel, is still going to be able to do well because there's still that demand there.
I think, I mean, to Mintel, we're celebrating like our 50th anniversary this year. So we've been through a few recessions, and I'm trying to work out, I don't know, depending on what you count as a recession, I think this might be my third since I joined Mintel. Like the COVID one, I don't know if that counts as half a recession or not. But there's all these behaviours that you see coming through every time. And so the holidays is a really good example where people will try and cut spending, but people are really reluctant to ditch holidays altogether. So, they'll shift away from short breaks, like emphasize the longer summer holiday over them sometimes. There's other areas where spend can be cut pretty much or put on hold indefinitely. So stuff like white goods, they're always hit pretty early in a recession. And I think you can start to see some of those reports coming through as well. So there are categories where people will just almost drop out altogether unless they have to replace their washing machine or their fridge freezer or whatever.
And we've done research into this recently. Sam, it's not good news for you, I'm afraid. You might want to hold your ears. But holiday spending is when we ask people about what areas of spending they would most prioritise if they had to make cutbacks, holiday spending is the top one. So of people who ordinarily would spend on holidays, 54% of people say it's among the top categories they'd want to retain spend on. In contrast, premium beauty and grooming products comes out bottom of that list. Only around a fifth of people saying they'd prioritise it. And it kind of comes back to that idea of experience. You can treat yourself with premium beauty and grooming products. But when people have been through that period of, the pandemic era, and we've still got to consider that a factor when people are making these decisions, they are still choosing to prioritise experiences. And that's where holidays and stuff like that really comes through quite strongly.
But I mean, that's also where this gets really, really messy, because it's really hard to know what is pandemic behaviour. So what people are doing because they're worried about COVID, how much of this is sort of a bounce back from COVID and a pushback against it, and how much of it is just because a lot of those COVID behaviours were also sort of recessionary type behaviours. So it's for different reasons, but people couldn't go out for dinner, they couldn't spend on food service, they didn't go out as often. So those are all the kind of stuff you'd expect to see during a recession. And it's like I say, it's just really messy. Like, how much of this is a hangover from the pandemic? How much of this is recessionary type behaviour coming through already?
Yeah, I mean, to second that, it's definitely hard to pin down what's happening in beauty right now, because we've got the kind of the after effects of the pandemic and the fact that actually lipstick sales have done not great in the last couple of years, almost terribly. But whereas they're doing exceptionally well now, but is that because consumers are coming out of lockdown and that's, the inevitable replenishment of products as they actually start to go back into workplaces and start socializing more? Or is it the fact that it's, coming straight back to that thing that it's an affordable treat during kind of difficult times? So it's definitely challenging, as you say, to kind of analyze it properly. But I do think, there's definitely scope for those kind of trends to re-emerge. And I think one of the things that, to follow on from Richard's point about, people not necessarily prioritizing premium beauty as we go forward, is since the last recession, I do think the one thing that's changed quite significantly in beauty is the availability and the choice. So kind of value, mass market options are now far more sophisticated than they were last time around. So that trade down isn't as much of a compromise. And that's something that we're definitely talking about more and more at the minute. So I'm going to move the conversation on again. So again, this is something that's come up countless times with some of our beauty and personal care categories, but it's also coming up with analysts in other categories. And it was one of the most asked kind of questions after the British Lifestyles webinar. So how do we think priorities are going to change? So will consumers continue to prioritize things like sustainability, health, charitable giving, all the things that we've kind of been talking about over the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic and afterwards? Do we think they're still going to be high on the priority list?
So we know from research that we did in June that climate change in particular is still a level of concern, at least. The difficulty for consumers is balancing that concern with how much they can afford to prioritize it right now. And so that raises opportunities and also challenges for brands, because we are going to see an element, and we're already seeing an element of purchase behaviors that were previously driven by sustainability concerns are going to be superseded by price and more immediate factors. But the concerns that underpinned those choices previously are still there. And so there's an opportunity for brands that have got a new consumer coming in, maybe trading down from potentially an eco brand to a mainstream brand or a white label. There's an opportunity to show those people the products that you're now choosing can actually serve those purposes. So we're seeing stuff like durability becoming a more valuable commodity, because you might not be able to put money into the super eco-conscious brand that you previously supporting with your product choices, but you are able to make a relatively green choice by purchasing a product that lasts longer, for example.
I mean, for some people, they're just not going to have a choice. They can't spend extra on recycled products or products with a stronger ethical tinge, because they just need to make every single penny count. But then you've got the flip side of that you've got, the main, the real push for sustainability is this whole idea of recycle, reuse, reduce. And actually, in a way, I mean, that's also recessionary behavior. I mean, the ultimate sustainability move is to buy less stuff. And that's also a way of saving money. So like these behaviors, you can reframe them in a way that actually sort of does become more sustainable. So what we saw last time, like in previous recessions, we've seen an increase in the people buying sort of investment items of clothing. So you spend a little bit more, but you buy something that you know is going to last, which is a value play on one level, because, all right, so you're spending more, but you're going to get more use out of it. But also that's a sustainability angle, because you're not contributing to landfill, you're not buying into fast fashion as much. So there's ways that you can combine it even in tough times.
Yeah, I'd agree with what both Toby and Richard said there about how kind of this is going to be a time where consumers can really use brands' help to make those green and ethical decisions for them when they're going to be more kind of strapped. But just picking up on the point you mentioned about charitable giving and kind of priorities there. So obviously this is going to be a really difficult time for charities because they will both be facing their own rising operational costs, as well as obviously the people that are normally donating to them are going to be facing, higher costs in their lives, which means they'll be feeling less comfortable to donate to. And actually from the last recession, the trends they were seeing in charitable giving was that not that less people were donating, but the amount they were donating was falling. And that's kind of something we've seen in our research too. So I think it was back in April when we were asking about people's charitable behaviours, and the proportion of consumers that were donating was staying the same. So it's around 2/3 of people, and it has been for the past few years. But the amount that people were able to donate was kind of polarised between those people that were able to spend quite a lot and those people that were doing what they call micro donating, so donations that are less than kind of £10. So I think it's going to be really a tough time, and obviously it's going to mean that some people have to pull their charitable donations, and that will inevitably be the case. But for those people where they can still afford to, I think it's going to be for charities pushing those micro donations wherever possible, and also utilising those online methods and digital methods of donations that are becoming increasingly more popular, especially among those younger adults who actually might be doing a bit better in terms of with the current situation because they haven't got less financial responsibilities.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know if I'm completely going to divert the conversation here and going off on a very separate issue, but I feel like it's worth kind of discussing kind of employee support. So I feel like we're talking about consumers, and consumers are obviously in the most part employees as well. So A, do we think how do we think brands and businesses can support employees? And B, do we think when consumers see any of those messages around, say, for example, I know there's been kind of a lot of retailers coming out and saying, what they're doing to support consumers. Do we think those kind of impact purchase decisions in terms of where people, for example, choose to shop or the brands that they choose to support?
You can see that. I mean, there's a few brands coming out already that are making quite high-profile statements about how they are, using some of their profits to pay their workers higher prices. I think you can say there's a bit of a parallel with that, with what seems kind of quite widespread support for the industrial action that we're seeing at the moment. So there's a lot of industries where people are striking. And it does sort of feel that in the middle of the cost of living crisis, those strikers have a good amount of sympathy from the general public about sort of trying to fight to protect their incomes. So you can see some employers sort of going quite public and saying, like, we are supporting our team. Like, even if that means we've got to put price rises through, we're going to increase those wages. And so then it kind of becomes an employee well-being and potentially a branding opportunity as well. I think every recession is different, but one thing that's really unusual about this one is just how strong employment is as well. So vacancies are high, employment is really high. Companies are still, despite the fact that the economy is already looking a little bit shaky. I know, it's the same at Mintel. It's really, really hard to recruit in this market. So that push to make sure that employees are looked after and that wages are kept up is actually, that becomes a competitive advantage in what still is, like I say, a really tight employment market.
Yeah, just to put a kind of a blunt point on it, research that we've done shows that around a fifth of people who are currently in work so that they're considering changing jobs because of the rising cost of living. So it is something that people are seeing as a way through the challenge of inflation. There's two ways of looking about it, right? Even if you take it in its simplest terms, you can either spend less or you can earn more, and people are looking at both of those options. As Toby says, the employment market is really quite strong at the moment in the UK still, and it doesn't look like it's going to change radically anytime soon. So it is arguably a strong position for employees to operate in. Having said that, brands and employers are only going to find it more difficult to meet their own inflationary challenges. So they do need to find more innovative ways of supporting employees if they can't meet those wage demands.
Yeah, and I think one way of doing that, where of course, wage increases would be ideal, but not always possible, is through that offering more flexibility and a better work-life balance, which we're seeing come through in all the research is what employees really want a top reason for moving jobs was to earn more money, but apart from that, it was for better work-life balance. So I think it's a flip side. You've got two sides to this. So in one way, offering more flexibility is going to help the employees by saving money. So this could either be through reduce from working from home remotely, so they could reduce or cut out commuting costs altogether, or it can be through more flexible hours, so they can avoid paying peak travel costs. And then this is also going to really improve employee well-being, because we know it's something that they really want. So it kind of will benefit both the employee financially, and kind of they'll be happier at work as well.
So that's interesting. That's basically another take on this whole pandemic behaviour blurring into recessionary behaviour as well. Because that obviously was kick-started by the pandemic. But what you're saying makes perfect sense. It's a way of helping manage costs during an economic slowdown as well.
Another downside for beauty, because if you're working from home, it's far easier to put your Zoom filter on and not bother with your makeup. But
then I think you've almost got the opposite though. So with household, household and beauty seem to be moving in a totally different direction. Where household was kind of like the star of the show during the pandemic, because people were spending so much more time at home, they had to clean more often. That focus shifted back onto the home, and then as the world has returned to something closer to normality, household hasn't done as well. It'd be interesting to see whether the recession starts sort of shifting that into reverse, or at least slowing the return to sort of more average, more normal levels for household. I know that you have stuff like scented candles that did well during previous recessions, and it exactly that kind of lipstick effect idea, where you're sort of cocooning. You can buy a premium product that isn't massively expensive. It makes you're at home more often. It makes the home a nice, sort of more indulgent place to be. That also came through during the pandemic. Then it started falling off. It'd be that's the kind of thing that you could see sort of having a bit of a bounce back in the next year or so.
Yeah, I did see some articles circulating around financial lockdowns and the fact that people might be forced to stay at home. So might suddenly start reviving all of those pandemic behaviours that we picked up during COVID.
Surely there's only so many times we can talk about home baking though. I've been talking about home baking throughout the last 15 years solid. At some point, people are going to stop wanting to make bread and cakes.
Everybody always wants bread and cakes.
True.
So, moving the conversation on again, I feel like we've talked a little bit now around the impact on consumers, how they're feeling, what they're doing. But now I want to explore the impact on brands. So how do we think, or how are brands being impacted so far, and what do we think is going to happen as we look ahead?
I think the most fundamental point to make is obviously they've got their own inflationary challenges. So as much as consumers are seeing prices rise on shelves, so are brands. And when they're dealing with their providers, and also when they're dealing with their own logistical issues, costs are going up everywhere. And so what's quite interesting is the decisions that they're having to make, and related to that, the demands that are being placed on those types of decisions by end consumers. And so the basic question is, how much do they just absorb these price rises, and how much do they pass them on to consumers? And in an ideal world, they'd pass on 100% of any increase in price, and there'd be no ramifications for that, and consumers would be able to take the hit and pay for these inflationary issues. Obviously, that's not the case, and so we have seen across different categories, at least conversations about the types of approach that brands can take, and that's kind of centered around things such as shrinkflation, so reducing pack sizes, reducing product sizes, and skimpflation, so reducing the quality of individual products. And so we've asked consumers about this, and we've split it out into different categories, and it's interesting to see how the responses play out in those categories. So in grocery, when we talk about everyday food and drink spending and household spending, consumers are really quite split, but it's interesting that increasing the price is seen as the last option. It's seen as a last resort, and there is support for reducing the quality of products and reducing the size of products before increasing the price. So consumers are, to some extent, flexible and willing to work with brands, to take innovative approaches to avoid those price rises. But when you step out of the sort of the day-to-day, that flips on its head entirely, and we can see, going back to something that we talked about a few times, the importance of experience. Because when we ask the same question, and we ask it about holidays and we ask it about pubs and restaurants, people are much more supportive of just putting up the prices. If a brand is having to make a decision around putting up prices or reducing quality, if it's something that people are paying to treat themselves with, paying to have a good time, they'd rather just pay more for it and potentially do it less frequently than take a hit on the quality and it not being potentially worth it.
The thing about that question, which kind of surprised me, is one of the options was, so we had increase, if a brand was facing higher costs, it was like, would you rather they increase prices, reduce pack sizes, use cheaper ingredients? And the last one was stop running promotions and discounts. And I was like wary about putting that last coding, because I thought that was just too easy an option and that everyone would just choose that as a way of sort of, as almost like a no cost way to brands having to deal with rising input costs. But actually, there was still quite a lot of support for promotion and keeping those special offers going, which is really different to what happened in the last recession, when you got that big wave of like everyday low pricing, where the emphasis was on about price transparency and price simplicity and being able to go to the supermarket and knowing what is going into your basket, how much it's going to cost you, without having to work out like what's this for 2 for 1 and what's this 15% off, and just all the sort of other noise that's around it. So I thought that was an interesting angle on it. I kind of really thought people would say, okay, just stop messing about with special offers, but that didn't really come through with this question. I don't know. Well, yeah, I mean, they kind of do, but then, like I say, last time round, that's where the mainstream grocers really got caught out, because they got so stuck into discounting and complicated pricing. And then Aldi and Lidl came in and just had that really, really simple option. Like, you just go in, there aren't thousands of different products. Like, you don't look at an entire row full of shampoos or whatever. And the pricing was really transparent. And that was really, really appealing after the financial crisis. Like, that really worked in their favour. It doesn't seem to be playing out this way this time.
I was going to say, this time around, you're seeing a lot of the other supermarkets are making like a direct effort to kind of price lock and drop their products and make sure they're kind of matching with Aldi and Lidl. So I think that's one way that they're going to try and, like you said, with the I think one of the supermarkets has been raising their wages as well for their staff. So I think those kind of things are going to look good in these times, and maybe keep their support.
Another issue when we look back to comparing what we're seeing now with what we saw through the financial crisis is brands are having to really identify where they are in the market. It's important in ordinary times to know where you are in the market, but when we get into a downturn like this and consumers are making decisions, really tough decisions on their spending habits, it's not just a case of a race to the bottom in price. That is very important, but we saw last time that brands that were able to focus on value and really stand out in that way found a way to succeed as well. The difficulty and the risk is being stuck in the middle, and I think that's something that a lot of brands are kind of grappling with at the moment, and finding a way to stick out. Can they stick out on price? Can they stick out on value? And if not, where are they going to be left? Because it is a bit of a risk to be in that middle ground.
I'm always really curious about the middle squeeze, because surely for different consumers, the middle is always going to be different. So what's the middle ground? And it obviously is hugely dependent on category as well. So there's always, what's middle ground to one consumer is expensive to another and cheap to another consumer. So I feel like I'm always curious about that middle kind of squeeze conversation.
Yeah, knowing your audience is a key part of knowing where you are in the market, right? Because if you're focusing on the lower end, then that middle ground really does still come down at the lower end of the market. So it might be that for some people, an indulgent purchase is simply buying the can of beans that isn't white label but is actually a branded option. So there's different solutions, there's different answers to that question based on the category. But I think what it comes down to at the moment is really factoring in those demographic differences between lower and higher earners, and remembering that we've still got that post-pandemic effect, and that's impacting the higher earners because they're still able to indulge on it. They're able to act upon it. Francesca mentioned earlier about the positive prospects that we see for luxury travel. And, that kind of comes down to, can you be the best experience? And so when we're talking about the bottom and the middle and the top of the market, I think it can be as blunt as, can you be the cheapest? Can you be the best? And if you can't be either, then it's going to be quite difficult.
Just another point on that, which I found really interesting when I was reading the British Lifestyles report, which kind of explains that gap really well, is that in the travel market, the two kind of best performing sectors are the luxury travel, but then also the camper van and caravanning holidays. So I think that really explains the kind of divide you're having for the people that can still afford to spend on their holidays and are wanting to splurge, and they've got that demand still from the pandemic. They're choosing obviously those luxury holidays where possible. But for those people that are struggling financially now but still see holidays and experiences as a kind of like that necessary luxury, they're choosing to obviously go for those cheaper options that are staycations, but are still kind of prioritizing that, which I think's a very interesting anecdote from it.
This kind of goes back to Sam's point. So when you're talking about camper vans being a cheaper option, I don't know if you've looked at how much it costs to hire a camper van recently, but
I think it's caravan, not camper van.
You look at it, so it's one of the. It's true about any sort of recessionary behaviour. So I said I'm sick of talking about home baking, but that was always fun as a way of saving money. And being someone who likes cakes, there's no way you're saving money by making your own cakes. It's always cheaper to go out and buy them. And so a lot of it is almost, it's going to sound a bit harsh, but like sort of poverty theatre, a way to feel like you're sort of making sacrifices and behaving in a recessionary way, but actually it's not really saving you that much money. So staycations, a lot of the time they can end up more expensive than getting a cheap package holiday, but you kind of feel like you're doing the right thing, and you get this sort of like halo that, we're staying in the UK, we're sacrificing our 2 weeks in a villa in the south of France or whatever, we're doing the right thing. It's like I said, there's a bit of theatre to it for some people sometimes. It's me being cynical.
So before we move, I've got another question about brands before we kind of move on to my next kind of theme. And this came from the British Lifestyles webinar again. I just thought it was really interesting. So how will consumers shopping down or trading down make decisions about which value retailers and brands to shop with?
Again, I guess it's relative, isn't it? If you spend your time shopping at Waitrose, then Sainsbury's is going to feel like a step down. I think, so loyalty, I know at British Lifestyles we've got a question about loyalty and whether that exists in a slowdown and whether people will shop around. I think what we're seeing for brands, again, like it's in opposition to that everyday low pricing we saw last time round, is that some of the big grocers are, especially Tesco, using their loyalty card offers really, really well, and like really, really investing in those. And so anything like that can help sort of tip the balance between different retailers. I think, a lot of the time it just comes down to habit and convenience as well. So, are people going to switch to a supermarket that's 15 miles away because they've got slightly lower prices than the one that's down the road? Probably not. So there's so many factors at play.
Following on from that, in terms of loyalty, you've just kind of hit the nail on the head there with saying, Tesco and some of those really big players are going really hard on the loyalty scheme thing at the minute. One thing that kind of came through from the questions that we got through for the BritLife webinar again was how difficult it is for kind of smaller players to compete with that. And actually, do we think, is there a way for some smaller brands to compete with things like loyalty schemes?
One thing I'd say that when times are difficult, knowing your customers is really, really important, because it's really easy for messages to go astray. It's really easy to just get the wrong tone of voice. And I think that's probably one area where smaller brands are at an advantage. Like when you are a company the size of Tesco or, the big multinationals, maybe you don't have quite such a strong understanding of your customers. And when you've got to appeal to absolutely everyone, you've got to try and create a product that works across the entire board. That's going to be hard to get any sort of real differentiation and cut through. And if you're a smaller brand, if you're more agile, then you're probably in a better position to respond to your customers' needs better than the really, really big brands. I think, one of the big things with the recessions is like, there's always disruption, and that always leads to change. And, coming out of the financial crisis, for example, it took a few years to come through, but you've got this whole new wave of startups that are people, a lot of them sort of came out of big companies, and the financial crisis made them reassess their priorities and thought, actually, no, I don't want to be doing this. I want to do something on my own. I want to start out and then set up my own business. And then a few years later, you really saw the payback, like a lot of disruption, especially in food and drink. Like you saw the big multinational food and drink companies really getting hit by these smaller, more agile brands that kind of really nailed those customer demands. I think at any time where people are sort of having to make difficult choices and really think about what they're spending, if you can be more agile and more in touch with your customers, then that actually does give you a bit of an edge. You might not have the buying power of Tesco or Aldi or, Walmart or whoever, but if you can get the right products out there that fit the consumer mood, then that will win out eventually.
Yeah, also this is kind of more of an open question, I guess, than a statement, but I kind of look back to the height of the pandemic and the lockdown behaviours that people adopted. A lot of them through no choice of their own. We were restricted on where we could go, but local retailers did quite well during that period, and we saw much more of a focus on localism. If we do get into this position of Sam, you mentioned it earlier about financial lockdowns and people revert into quite recent behaviours where they weren't spending money and they were, for a different reason because of COVID, but they were staying closer to home and they were treating themselves in different ways. I wonder if we'll see a revisiting of those behaviours and again, local stores that are able to stay there for consumers benefiting in that way.
It is. It comes back to this idea that when things are disrupted, people really think about what matters to them. And if you see local shops, smaller brands struggling, then actually there is the chance that people will step in and try and actively support them. If they see that people know that times are tough for businesses as well as for consumers. So there is a degree of sort of capitalism on that sort of David versus Goliath approach of supporting your local companies or supporting your local brands. It won't all come down to price. And then we keep on mentioning British lifestyles, and I think so. We're forecasting consumer spending at 1.5 trillion for 2023, aren't we? And we're still expecting to see it's offset by inflation, but we're still expecting to see growth year on year in nominal consumer spending. So I think it's really important to remember that there is still money out there to be spent, and there are some people that are really struggling, but most people, Rich will know this line, just most people get by most of the time. There is still a huge amount of money out there. And so brands can't afford to just sort of shut down and just sort of panic and try and cut costs. And it's not all just going to be about price. There's other stuff at play still.
Perfect. So that leads me to my last question. I'm going to put you all on the spot now. So thinking about the conversation that we've had, if you had one piece of advice that you would give to businesses right now, what would it be?
I'll go first. It's kind of stealing what Toby just said, but I would say that, of course, price is going to be really at the forefront of consumers' minds and brands' minds. But I think, they shouldn't be forgetting about all the other concerns that people have and priorities that people have. So the main one I would say, again, is that sustainability concern. And this is a time where brands can really help consumers make those good ethical decisions on their behalf. So I don't think they should be forgetting that.
I remember after this, during the pandemic, we were talking about what this meant for brands, and Johnny Forsyth made the really good point that at the moment people might not be as worried about sustainability, but we know that it's been a trend that's coming. We know that's becoming more and more important to consumers, and it's been rising the last 10, 15 years or whatever, and it's not just going to disappear overnight. So a brand that just goes dark now and just focuses entirely on price, and then suddenly in 3 years' time when everything's looking a bit better, is just ta-da, we were green all along, surprise, we're still really ethical. People aren't idiots, and they'll see through that. So you can put it to the background slightly, but you can't, it's not something you can just switch off and on like a light. I think my main point, I've already kind of touched on it, but it's just that and we're market research agency and we work with a load of advertisers, so of course we're going to say it. But there is a massive risk to going dark and just panicking and just shutting down and cutting down innovation spend, cutting down marketing spend, and just trying to sit it out for the next 2-3 years. Because things will get better at some point, things will improve. And it's kind of similar to that sustainability point. If you go dark now and sort of cut back on innovation, cut back on marketing, then you know that there are going to be other brands out there that aren't doing that. And I've just been working on a presentation about it, looking at what it means for people's recovery coming out of a recession. If you do shut down too hard now, then you're going to lose so much ground on your rivals when things do start picking up.
Yeah, and I think my point, as well as Toby mentioned his before, is something that I've already said. It's something that I've been saying quite often recently, and it's a really simple message, which is that it is really, really, really important that brands know who their audience is, know who they're wanting to target, and to target them quite aggressively. Yes, a lot of brands are going to focus on value and particularly on price, and almost go for that sort of race to the bottom competition. But there are huge opportunities still at the higher end of the market. We're coming out of the pandemic still. It's a delayed recovery. This year was supposed to be the big recovery from COVID, and obviously it's not worked out like that. But we know that there's still a mountain of lockdown savings that can be unlocked if you can get the right message and show that you're offering the premium experiences that higher end consumers are looking for. So don't be afraid to target that end of the market, and don't be afraid to use issues other than price and value to market those products and services. Just don't get stuck in the middle.
So on that note, I think that is all we have time for today. We have covered so much in this conversation. Before we finish, I'd like to do a very brief recap on the conversation and highlight some of the key takeaways for our listeners. So the reality of it is that consumers are worried about their finances, and behaviours are shifting as a result. Consumers are really looking for value, and they are willing to move around and switch to different brands and different retailers to try and find that value for money. But other factors continue to influence their decision making, including things like convenience, but also things like sustainability and corporate ethics as well. Then from a brand perspective, the key takeaway is there are opportunities at every price point. Many consumers will still be looking to indulge, and they often remain willing to spend on things like experience. And with that, brand agility continues to play a role in success. So being able to shift and respond to consumers and what they want, and also be taking into consideration the importance of being front of mind, is something to take into consideration. So things like innovation and marketing can really put a spotlight on you and help you stand out in a challenging environment. So thank you very much to everyone for listening today. The conversation doesn't end here. Please head over to Mintel's LinkedIn and Instagram and let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the rising cost of living, what it means for consumers, and also what it means for businesses too. If you want to know more about Mintel, who we are and what we do, head over to mintel.com and follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And please do also check out our blog for even more insights from our analysts. Finally, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. And that is goodbye for now, and we'll catch you next time for a new episode of Mintel's Little Conversation.